Hello, fellow mortals. Whenever you're listening to this, welcome back to the Don't Panic, We're All Going to Die podcast. Whoever you are, however you are, hell, whenever you are, I appreciate you choosing to spend some time with us today. And as always, I'm going to try my best to make it worth your while. Today I have Vincent Nel joining me. Vincent is the director of production at Cornerstone Church in San Francisco. He's the host of TheARTology podcast. I had to practice saying that. And he is also a playwright, filmmaker, and a single dad. So he is busy to say the least, which is why I was so thankful that he was willing to spend some time talking to me. In this episode, we talk about movies and the impact they can have on the way that we look at the world. We talk about our dads and the complicated relationships men oftentimes have with their fathers. And then we have an honest conversation about depression, anxiety, but we also talk about religion. In this episode, you'll hear Vincent talk about his faith. If you are religious, then it's all gravy, baby. And I think you're really going to like this conversation. If you're not, then I think there's still plenty of goodies here for you too. So thank you for listening. I hope you like what we have for you today. And here's our conversation. Okay, so Vincent, like I said, I feel like I should probably apologize to you for hassling you to schedule this, but I appreciate you making the time.
Thanks, Johnny. I don't mind being hassled by you anytime, and I mean that. And I hope I have something wise to say with that setup.
Oh, I'm sure you do. In your podcast, I think you say a ton of wise things, but we'll get into that in a minute. I think maybe the best place to start would just be to hear about your story and how did people may already be detecting an accent coming from you. So maybe you could tell us your story and kind of how you ended up in the United States.
Sure. So this accent is fake. I actually have been making up my whole life. Kidding, joking. So I was born and raised in Cape Town, South Africa. That is my accent. There are many different kinds of accents in South Africa, but mine is sort of the English version of a South African accent. I had a love of film since I was a wee little lad. I had movie parties for my birthdays. I would wake up at 3 a.m. and watch the Oscars because that's what time they were streamed live. I just loved all things movies. And apparently in junior school, we call it primary school. Apparently in primary school, probably around third or fourth grade, I would force my friends to act in plays at break time, at recess. I have no recollection of this, but they are convinced that I did this, and it sounds true to my brand. But yeah, I always loved film. I loved especially American film, because that's kind of most of the films we got. And so when it came to high school, what do we do after high school? We go to college, we pursue our dreams. I didn't want to go to college in South Africa. There were one or two film programs, but back then, this was like, 2004, 2005, 2004 I graduated high school. There were not a lot of options for filmmakers back then. The world was, I think, much bigger. There wasn't Facebook, there wasn't YouTube. This was before all that time, so I'm kind of old. I remember going to the American Embassy in person. My dad made an appointment for me, and I sat with some lady there, and she told me about what American college is like, and she handed me this big book of all these colleges I could try apply to, and that's as much as I knew how to do. It took me a year and a half after I graduated high school to figure out how to get to America, and I did. My dad had saved money for me for my first year of college, and after doing some research, I figured out that going to a community college, which I had no idea what those were because we don't have them, was going to be the same price as a film school program in Cape Town. So I decided to take the money and move to America on a student visa, which took me 18 months to get. And then in 2005, I started a film program at City College of San Francisco. I was there for 2 years. I worked really hard to transfer to UCLA, which was my dream school. I made it to the interview round, to the final round of students, but then they said no, which was hard not to take personally. But I think life worked out pretty great after that. I ended up going to SF State, got a Bachelor of Arts in Cinema Production with a emphasis in screenwriting. And then I got a work visa through the church that I am still employed at. And then I got married, so now I have a green card. But my joy and my love has always been film. And it's, I think, the language that I think in, it's the language that I speak. And I'm sort of on the brink of a new chapter, figuring out what that means in this next chapter of my life. So that is my story in terms of film. My faith journey is similar to that. I came to know Christ in high school. I grew up in the church, but it was really late years of high school where I had sort of an existential crisis. I was like, what if God is not real? And I just went a whole year thinking. Actually, God spoke to me in a movie. I think I said that in one of my podcasts. Wasn't sure if he was real or not, but he showed himself real to me, and then I've been following him ever since. It hasn't been easy, and I've been wanting to walk away many times. But yeah, now I am full time creative pastor at a church. So those are kind of my two loves in life, theology and film, which is why I started the podcast.
Right. Well, thank you for sharing that. And TheARTology, am I saying that right? TheARTology.
TheARTology, and here's the thing. I was told when I picked that name that no one was going to be able to say that name and that it's a terrible name and I should just change the podcast to the subtitle, which is Finding God in the Movies. And I said, no. You're taking my vision and you are ruining it. I don't care that people say it wrong. It's TheARTology. Basically, it's like the word theology, but with the word art shoved in there. TheARTology. But you can call it whatever you want. So just listen.
Well, I actually disagree with your critics in terms of naming the podcast because I think you don't really say the name of podcasts too often, except in the rare instances that you're recommending them to friends. But it's too clever to not name it that, and I like spelling it. I think it looks cool when it comes up in my Spotify feed. So I disagree with your critics, and I'm glad you stuck with your gut. But what I was going to say in regards to your podcast is that one thing I like about it is that you don't need to be religious to listen to it or to get wisdom out of it. Like, just to give you a little bit of context, I used to go to church, don't really go to church anymore, but I still find a ton of wisdom in listening to the podcast. And I've listened to every episode, by the way, so very well versed in TheARTology. But in this podcast, you do.
Thank you for saying it correctly.
Of course, I had to really think about it. But in this podcast, one thing I noticed that you like to do is you like to use quotes. You quote famous people or famous writers, authors, filmmakers in your podcast to illustrate some of the points you're making. And I'm a quote fiend myself, so those are definitely things that resonate with me. But I thought maybe I could give a Vincent Nel quote to my listeners and then have you maybe expand on it.
Sure.
So, in your first episode, you talk about movies and you talk about them in the context of storytelling. And you said something I really liked, which was there's a unique power in storytelling. They have a unique way of communicating us to a place in our hearts that may have otherwise gone untouched. They teach us things that we don't fully understand. They help us see other people with compassion and empathy. They help us identify or see ourselves in the stories, and we are inspired by them and moved to improve aspects of our humanity. They speak to the deep human longings that we all have. We all want a love that lasts, for good to triumph over evil, and we all want a grand adventure. I think that pretty much encompasses every reason why I like movies, but right after that you said, your friend watches Spirited Away to restore her faith in humanity. And then you replied that all movies do that for you. So what did you mean by that?
Sure. Are you sure I said that? That sounds pretty wise. And I think what I meant by that is there's value in all art, even if it's bad or if it's art you don't like. Art can bring value to the world and to you if you allow it. But just the very experience itself of sitting down to watch a story fills me, even if it's a bad story. Now, if it's not told very well, it's okay. There's still some things I might get out of it, or I might learn how to do it better. But just being able to hear a story where it'll take me out of my own world, out of my own problems, even for an hour or two, that's invigorating. That, I think, fills me up. And I also enjoy watching really depressing films. When I was going through my period of grief many years ago after my wife died, I went to watch Manchester by the Sea, which is an incredibly depressing film. And I was so excited to see this film, and I saw it on like Christmas Eve. And people were like, why are you going to watch that on Christmas Eve? And just be careful. I said, no, you don't understand. Like, this is going to be good for me. And it was beautiful, and I cried in the cinema, and it was just a beautiful film because it was written by someone who's experienced grief, and just was I was able to be seen. And so, we talk about representation. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
important to be seen in these films. And that was a moment where I was able to process something that was going on in my life through a story, and was able to touch parts of myself maybe that I wasn't ready to engage with by myself or didn't know how to access. And so I think what I mean by, my love for these films and how it rekindles, just rekindles my faith in humanity is just the very experience of watching something that was created and it being a story just reminds me of the power that's in that story. It connects me to the core of who I am, and ultimately for me as a Christ follower, connects me back to the Lord. As a filmmaker, it's also hard to sort of find films that really blow me away.
Mm-hmm.
My standards are a little higher than most people probably.
Sure.
But every now and then there's a film, maybe every few years, that really just reminds me why I wanted to be a filmmaker. Some of them are just amazing. I'm like, oh, I could never make that. And this is just a random one, but like 10 years ago when The Social Network came out,
Oh, yeah.
I remember watching that with my two buddies, and I felt like weeping at the end of that film. And it wasn't because the film was sad. It was, if you've seen The Social Network, it's a thriller about the start of Facebook. It was just so amazingly crafted. And I was so overcome with how wonderfully constructed that film was from all aspects that it reminded me why I loved film. And so sometimes when you experience a movie that touches you in that way, it reminds you of the beauty of art. And so it just sort of connected with me in that way. Does that make sense?
Completely.
And also, like another movie, The Greatest Showman, right?
Mm-hmm.
I love the music in that film. The film itself was lacking. There's something off about the film, about the pacing or something, and I haven't figured it out yet. That's maybe another podcast to come. But I watched a YouTube video of the lady, Keala Settle, who auditioned for the role of the bearded lady, and Hugh Jackman is in the room, and they were workshopping it. And she sang the song that she sings in the movie, This Is Me, which is a fabulous anthem. And she sang the song in this workshop. But when she sang it, she looked at Hugh Jackman, and he started crying, and she started crying. And I tell you, I sobbed for a good 15 minutes after watching that clip.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what touched me is like there's this, for me as a creator, as an artist, there's this beauty in creating art that moves this part of your soul, part of your spirit that's in you, that doesn't otherwise come out. And so when I have these moments, when you see these moments, it's like you can touch them almost. And so that moment was probably more, that moment behind the scenes that was filmed on someone's iPhone was more powerful than that whole movie. But sometimes those end up in the film. And so it's this sort of, this thing that we have inside of us that the films, I think, allow us to rekindle. And that's what it does for me.
Oh, that was beautifully said. It's funny that you bring up The Social Network because I watched it last night. It's one of my going to bed movies. Like if I'm like kind of tired, I just want to put something on TV. It's like The Social Network has always been one of my go-tos. But one of the things I have to be careful is that I always get sucked in when I put it on before I go to bed. So there'd be times where I'm like, I need to put something on, and then all of a sudden it's midnight and I've watched the entire thing for the 100th time. So
I can't fall asleep to movies. How do you do that?
I think it's just practice. Yeah, it used to be The Office, but then they took it off Netflix, and I'm not going to pay for Peacock, so I've had to switch to movies. But I think that was really well said, and I think like with this podcast, I bring artists on all the time because I think that really what this is a philosophy podcast in disguise. But I think that there's philosophy, and it makes its way into art, and then we understand philosophy through art. And I think that's maybe what you touched on.
Exactly. Yes.
And
I feel that 100%.
Yeah, it helps us make sense. I think the thing that you and I have in common is that sometimes it's art, and I know that you and I are huge movie guys. I think with movies, because it is the most collaborative medium. For me, it always cuts to a place much deeper than other art forms do. I feel differently when I look at a painting or a sculpture or listen to a piece of music. They all kind of touch me differently, but I feel like with movies, I'm like being ambushed from all sides in a good way.
No, I agree. That's probably why it's my favorite artistic language.
Yeah. it provides an outlet to those emotions. Like you mentioned, when you're feeling grief, you can go and watch a movie like Manchester by the Sea, and you can have like a cathartic experience. Or like for me, one of the movies you talked about having a movie come along once every like 10 years or so, or I'm not sure the dates that you gave, but that just it's almost like a punch to the gut because it's like it's almost like there was a microphone in your brain and then it like came to life on screen. I felt that way when I watched the movie Her, which when I tell people who have seen
Oh.
it, most of the time they're like, "Oh, is that the one about the guy that falls in love with Siri?" And I'm just like, "It is, but it's so much more than that." And I think that's what the beautiful thing about movies are, and what your podcast is really about is kind of like why they are so much more than just movies and the lessons they can teach us. So I did want to ask you, one of the conversations that we had was, in terms of movie characters, and because really movies are, they're the all-encompassing art form, but really what it's about is storytelling, and storytelling is done through character and character development. So I'm curious to hear from you. Do you have any maybe movie characters that have made a specific impact to you and maybe changed the way that you view yourself or the way that you looked at the world?
I mean, there are characters in films that I love and that I aspire to, and I wish. Like my favorite film is Lord of the Rings, all three.
Mm-hmm.
My favorite of the three is The Return of the King.
Yeah.
Objectively, The Fellowship of the Ring is the best, and The Two Towers is just there because you can't have three without the middle.
Yeah.
That's my
I agree with
opinion.
your take, by the way. I'm on the
Thank
same
you,
page.
thank you. People are like, oh, The Return of the King, all the endings. I'm like, guys, it is like masterful. Okay,
Yeah.
and The Fellowship of the Ring is just perfect. Anyway, I digress. But so, like, The Lord of the Rings, which is my favorite film, I love both the characters of Frodo and Sam. I love Frodo because I've realized, some people say he's useless. Like, what did he even do? And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
that's kind of the whole point. Number one, the lesson in Frodo is that you can't really get far without a fellowship. You need a fellowship in your life,
Mm-hmm.
and you need someone like Sam to help you. But secondly, people who say that are obviously not a ring bearer. For
Mm.
me, there's been a lot of parts in my life where I feel like I'm a ring bearer and only I can carry this. And it's a very lonely place to be, and it's a very, you know, it requires a lot of strength and you get tired, and so you need the fellowship around you. And so I relate to Frodo in that way. It's like, you know, in sort of the things I feel like I've been burdened to carry, or some of the things that the Lord has put in my life, I'm a ring bearer, and so I just naturally gravitate to Frodo because I know what it's like to live out this quest and have to carry this out, and that only you can do it. Only I can throw it into Mount Doom.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I also love Sam because every Frodo needs a Sam, and I've spent, a large part of my life looking for a Sam, looking for someone who could walk into the fires with me, who would swim and drown, not leave me go by myself, and I would hope that I could be a Sam to someone.
Mm.
I probably am going to be more of a Frodo, kind of a little more self-absorbed, like let me do my quest. But
Mm-hmm.
I would hope that I could be a Sam. So that maybe answers the question. Yeah, and then when you do find character, what is it about that character that you love, or what is it about the character you don't like? Like Ted Lasso, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not a film, but gosh, I wish I was that sunny. But I'm not. I'm a happy go lucky guy, but
Yeah.
honestly, I'm more like Coach Beard. I'm more like, get the work done, go. I'm not going to encourage you all the time. I wish I were like um, Ted Lasso, but I'm more like Coach Beard, and that's okay, so live into your strengths. Aspire to glean some of the character traits that we find in the characters we like, but also own who you are and grow into that.
Mm. I love that. And I think you're right in that I feel like Frodo really doesn't get enough credit. Like
Right.
that ring is a heavy burden, and I think
And he destroyed it, but it also destroyed him. And I know he didn't want to, but still, like, right?
yeah, it's symbolic because there are so many moments in life where you do feel like a ring bearer, but it's ultimately up to you to kind of figure out a way to throw things in the fire, so to speak. And he really doesn't get enough credit, but I do think that there is a powerful lesson in the fellowship and learning how to rely on other people because you don't need to go through life by yourself, and you're always
Exactly.
able to ask for help, and it's a big part of what this podcast is about. So I really
Yeah,
like that you picked that answer.
and it's true. Everything you said is true. But also, like, one of the things that I related to with Frodo is that, once he threw that ring in the fire, it destroyed part of him. you know, he didn't just go back to his life. He says distinctly, and I remember this, like, how can you go back to the life you had before?
Mm-hmm.
And, that's always stayed with me. But as I've grown older and continue to watch it, and especially having walked through like the death of my wife, that
Mm-hmm.
became even more profound. It's like there was this when I turned 30, I had sort of an existential crisis. I had a midlife crisis. I was
Mm-hmm.
like, okay, I've been married, I am a father, and I'm widowed, and I'm 30. I
Mm-hmm.
don't know what to do with the rest of my life. I've kind of hit all the checkpoints, and I was like, I don't want to start again. And so,
Mm-hmm.
when Frodo says, "How can you go back?" It's like I can't go back to the life I had. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I have to move to the Great Havens, and it's sad, but that's the ring that I've been given, and you have to decide what to do with the time that is given to you, as Gandalf says. So
Mm-hmm. Totally.
put that in your pipe weed and smoke it.
So Vincent, I know that you did mention that you were widowed at the age of 30, and in one of your podcast episodes, you talk about romantic comedies, and specifically My Best Friend's Wedding, and kind of how we oftentimes emphasize the idea of marriage as being the highest goal that one can achieve within a relationship. And I thought you had a lot to say about maybe the beauty of being single and the potential that brings to your life. I was wondering maybe if you could kind of expand on that and maybe some of the lessons that you've learned through your experience.
Hmm. Let me just listen to my podcast real quick and just quote it back to you.
Yeah.
um, Johnny, it is an ever-changing, nebulous cloud.
Mm-hmm.
I grow and I learn. Sometimes I take a lot of steps back. I often get confused because every choice you make is a denial of another choice. So, like, your
Mm-hmm.
whole life, every day, you're making you're saying no to hundreds of things. Every day, you're saying no to hundreds of things, and that's sort of like a very dready way to look at sort of life and the choice you make, because you're also saying yes to things and so many good things. Um, and I'm trying to say this in a way that doesn't fill your listeners with more dread.
No, please. That's what
But
this part of what it's about.
every choice you make is going to be difficult.
Mm-hmm.
Marriage is hard. It's not easy.
Mm-hmm.
If you marry the right person, it becomes easy, but it's still very difficult because you're two separate people with different expectations and different hopes and desires and different wavelengths. You're never going to be in sync all of the time. It requires immense grace and forgiveness. You see each other at your worst, but you grow and you learn to love and forgive. And so if you pick the right person and you grow together, it really is easier and more difficult than you ever would imagine. And so that's what I would say about that. At the same time, singleness is the same. There are aspects to being single that are easier. You don't have to run every decision through someone else. You can decide everything yourself, but at the same time, that gets exhausting. You also get lonely, when you're single. But you're also lonely in your marriage sometimes, because again, your spouse is a different person. Your spouse is never going to meet all your needs. And so I have found, having been on both these sides of the romantic sphere now, there's a certain longing that we have that will never be satiated. Now, that's not to say it's not valuable, because a lot of relationships, even in our human relationships, even if you think about parenting, is in the mundane. That's where you build the relationship. It's like after Aletha passed away, it's the small things that I missed as well as the big things. Obviously, you miss having a spouse to come home to, but it's like I missed the way that she would leave her spoons in the car side door because she would eat her oatmeal in the car.
Mm-hmm.
I missed the way that her wedding ring would tap on her wheelchair. And, so it's like the small things that I missed.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for my son, um, when he's at his grandparents, you know, I miss just his cute little voice. I miss when we're lying in the bed, the way that he puts his hand on my shoulder. It's like the small things you miss. And so even though a lot of relationships are carried out in the mundane,
Mm-hmm.
um, that's where it's built. I don't know where I'm at right now. I know that the season I'm at is one of singleness, Will I get married again? Could I get married again? The answer to that is could I? Yes. Is that something I desire? I'm not sure. I probably am a no for right now. But again, never say no to the Lord, never close yourself off to anything, but it's not something I'm actively pursuing. And so, what I'm trying to learn in this season is how can I, in this season of singleness, discover the aspects of God that I hadn't discovered before. You
Mm-hmm.
know, that's where I'm at. But also to sort of let go of this pressure that I have to get married again. I think we, especially in this modern day and age, live with this pressure that you have to get married, you have to have kids, and I don't think you
Mm-hmm.
have to. I don't think it's possible for everyone either.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think it's important to stop and ask yourself and to pray, if you're a believer, is this the path for me? If it's something you want, pray for it, go for it. But if it's not, it's okay.
Right. And also, like, there are some people that maybe like aren't cut out for relationships and aren't cut out to be parents, and to
Yeah.
make that as kind of a benchmark that everyone should aspire to, I think could be very damaging.
I agree. Yeah, and so it's like going back to the fellowship of the ring, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's like what you need in your life for sure is a fellowship. Now that can look
Mm-hmm.
different. Your fellowship can involve your spouse or not, but you can still have vital, intimate relationships with people who you're not married to. And I don't mean intimacy sexually. I mean intimacy emotionally. It's like you can have the love that Frodo and Sam had for each other. You know, and
Mm-hmm.
so you can still invite these people into your life and invest your life into those of others as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have my sword, Vincent. So.
Thank you. I will take it. But
uh,
can you protect me from yourself?
oh, that is a good question. I can't even protect myself from myself, so I don't know about that. One of the things I've incorporated into my routine the last 6 months is taking a walk every day. Seneca, a famous Stoic philosopher, believed that walks were nourishing to the soul. Nietzsche believed that every good idea he ever had came from going on a walk, and Hippocrates of Kos, who was a famous ancient doctor, which, quite frankly, I didn't know was a thing until I was looking up quotes about walking, once said, "If you're in a bad mood, go on a walk. If you're still in a bad mood, go on another walk." I have to say, I'm surprised by how often these walks have been the best part of my day. So if you're feeling a little anxious, feeling a little restless, try going for a walk and then see how you feel afterwards. All right, back to the conversation. So one thing I really wanted to kind of talk to you about was my favorite episode of yours, which was The Way of the Father. So it's a theme, that episode's theme is movies where fathers are kind of maybe unable to show their sons the way into manhood. And you said that this is really an important function of the father. And I felt like it was something that resonated with me a lot. So just to give you an idea, I think, all right, you mentioned that your dad was not an absent father in the episode, and that's something that I really related to. So my dad was not absent at all. In fact, he was always there. So, but I think that he saw his function as being kind of the provider, and so like I wrestled in high school. Tournaments are like 10 hours, and they're really boring because you fight like three wrestling matches like the entire day. But I remember he would always be there and he'd sit through the whole 10 hours, and he was really good in those regards. At the same time, I remember always feeling like some sort of dissatisfaction with our relationship because we can never really communicate verbally. So my dad's like this quintessential Gen Xer that Gen Zs love to make fun of, and anytime we had a one-on-one conversation, we'd end up talking about insurance or his job. And I don't know, I just kind of always remembered feeling jealous of kids in movies who had dads that would sit down and talk to them and have heart-to-hearts and provide guidance about how to be a man. And I think I ended up figuring out a lot of that by myself, and honestly through many of the women in my life as a result. But then something happened recently after I listened to the episode of yours, and you said something along the lines of, no father can love their son perfectly. And I thought about it a lot. And then the next time I was hanging out with my dad, it kind of hit me that, even though I wanted more from him, I also didn't feel like I was giving him as much as maybe I could have either. And so the next time I saw him, we don't see each other very often because we live in different places. But I was hanging out with him, and I focused on being more engaging and asking him more questions. And I realized that it wasn't all his fault. And I don't know. I realized I never came to him with anything either. And so it kind of put things in a new perspective for me. And then I think that all came to like a culmination. And over the holidays, there was like all these issues with the airlines. Me and my brothers had visited my parents. We were trying to get home. And my brother was trying to get on a flight, and he was at the airport for like 10 hours because they just had tons of staffing problems with COVID. And so he was trying to get back. He ended up being at the airport for 10 hours and then just having to come home. And he was just like so pissed about it. Like he was heated. And then he got in the car. And my dad was just like, you're choosing to be this upset. Everything that you're upset about is beyond your control. It's your choice in being this upset about it. And I was like, wait, that's like such a stoic quote. One of the lessons for me in life is being letting go of things that were outside of my control. And here's my dad giving my brother this wisdom, and it kind of like opened my eyes to like maybe there was times in my life where I just wasn't listening, and maybe my dad was trying to provide that guidance, and I just wasn't willing to accept it. And that's a very long setup to the question, but I'm just kind of curious to hear your perspective on that first and foremost, and just wanted to let you know that your podcast, I think, was really insightful for me in kind of improving a relationship with my dad to some degree.
Thanks. It means a lot to know that it's actually making a little difference.
Yeah.
Also because did we have the same father? Because yeah.
We were actually brothers.
Are we?
Yeah, dude. I wish I got your accent. That would have been nice.
I will respond by sharing this story, which happened recently, and it's similar to yours. I recently, over the New Year holiday, went home to South Africa. I spent just a week there. I left my son here with grandparents because it's such a brutal flight, and I just needed to see everybody. I have not been home in 5 years. So it's been 5 years since I saw my family in the flesh. I did see my sister 2 years ago. I flew her out here for Christmas. And I felt like it was time for me to see them again because having a family WhatsApp thread is not the same. And I was starting to, I think, feel a little alienated from my family. So I went home and my dad was camping. It's the middle of summer during Christmas there, and people usually go camping. And so he was camping for 3 weeks. And so my sister, my brother, and I drove up to go visit him. It was only an hour and a half away, so it's not bad. And I was remarking to some people when I got back that I spent an entire day with my dad, and I hadn't seen him in 5 years, and we spoke for maybe 20 minutes that entire day. And it wasn't, when I talked to people about it and when I spoke to my therapist about it, it's not necessarily a bad thing or a good thing. It's just something that I noticed and observed because I've been away for so long. I've sort of separated myself from him now. It was just something I observed, and I haven't yet really come to terms with it. Do I know that he loved that I was there? Yes. I think he was initially shell-shocked for the first hour or two. Do I know that he loved me and missed me? Yes, because the hug and embrace I got when I left was huge. Mm-hmm. We spoke briefly about my time in San Francisco, but mostly I spoke to his friend who was there. And mostly my dad just sat around the braai, which is a barbecue, and made sure that we had food and the radio was on. But I hadn't seen him in 5 years, and we spoke for about 20 minutes in an entire day. We all walked along the beach, and that was it, and so that's who my dad is. He doesn't speak. I don't know who he is as a person. I don't know what's going on in his mind, and my therapist said that there are people like that in that generation. I think my dad's probably older than your dad. But my therapist said that there are people who just don't have these complex emotions, and that's just them. But then there is people that do have these complex emotions, and they are just not able to communicate that, and it frustrates them. And he thinks my dad is that. And I agree, because I do believe my dad has complex emotions, but he has never been able to communicate them. And I also look at it like, he does a better job than his father did. I mean, his father basically drank himself to death. I didn't really know him. He died when I was young. That's probably not an accurate portrayal either, but I'm pretty sure it was liver poisoning. That's what I have to say about that. It's similar. It's like, I think we have to look at our parents, and in this case, particularly our fathers, as the men that they are. hopefully they did their best. I'm not talking about an abusive or absent father. I'm talking about these sort of indifferent fathers that we have. But
Yeah.
hopefully they did their best. And it likely wasn't good enough for us or what we needed, but they did what they did, and maybe we can take what they did and sort of learn to accept that, and then fill what we need in the other father figures that we find. And when I got back, my friend Phil said, well, did you ask your dad any questions? And I said, you know what, I didn't. And so it was interesting that sort of I was there for the whole day, and I also fell back into me being a teenager, not knowing what to say to my dad, and I don't really know what to say. I'm feeling a little bit uncomfortable. And so next time I go back, I would like to ask him questions. What was it like growing up? And what goes on in your mind? I'd like to be able to ask these questions next time, and hopefully I'll be able to prepare myself.
Appreciate you sharing that story, and I relate to it a lot. I think it's just to bring it back to movies briefly. I was watching Nightmare Alley the other day. I went by myself, and basically the premise of the movie is this guy, he learns how to be a fortune teller or of sorts, or some type of medium, in order to kind of scam people. And when he's learning how to become one, he's talking to like this guy who used to do it. He's like an old school guy who's kind of retired but used to be a master at it. And when he's teaching him how to become a fortune teller for men, he's like, the easiest thing that you can do is just say, you have a complicated relationship with your dad, because that's the case for everyone. And so I just thought it was really funny. It's one of those tough relationships, and there are a lot of like films and books about it, but it's different from every person. And I always remember, like, I think this is common, where like if your dad does something that you don't like, you're like, oh, well, I'm never gonna do that to my son. But then like you do other things to your son that your son doesn't appreciate, and then they're a whole different kind of messed up. And you just think that we have perfected it by now, but it just goes to show you that everyone's human and nobody's perfect. And as soon as you can,
yeah.
And then you learn how to accept that about your parents, and you can almost appreciate your relationship better with them, because they may not have been perfect, but they could have been much worse. And I think, at least with my dad, he was doing the best that he could given the circumstances and what he was capable of emotionally.
Yeah, and that's why I think going back home was important for me, because it had been so long, and I just needed to be in their presence and remind myself, oh, these are my parents, these are who I love, But exactly what you said, when you become a parent, it's interesting, because there's many things you think you will do and be as a parent, and then when you get to having a child, it changes. And you realize, oh, this is actually the kind of parent that I am. I didn't think that was possible. And then there's things that that you're lacking, so you work hard on fulfilling. But I am aware that Hosea will need therapy when he's older, as good of a dad as I think I am. And that will be a hard pill to swallow when he's like, Dad, you didn't measure up. Like, that's going to be tough, but that is going to have to happen, because I'm not perfect. And I'm just going to have to swallow that pill and learn.
So, a big part of this podcast is about anxiety, depression, and existential dread. And I just kind of wanted to hear from you. Is there anything going on in the world around you that is bothering you? And what would you see as maybe a potential solution to it?
I think currently what I don't like is how sort of unkind people are becoming, and sort of self-absorbed and very closed to the idea of God. I think that is sort of where I'm at. I see everything broken, and I see everything needs fixing, and so it's very hard to sort of be happy with anything. So that's my answer. The only way to fix it is to end it and start again.
Right. So maybe your answer is just maybe cynicism or nihilism.
Well, yeah, I don't want to be a cynic. I don't want to be a cynic, but I am, and I'm not a nihilist, because there's tons of beauty. I look at the way my son smiles and laughs. There's beauty in that. There's certain. When I drive to drop him from school, it's on Lincoln Avenue, which is not a very fun street to drive. It's very boring and traffic jammy. But lately, I've been looking at the way that the light hits the trees, and for some reason, it just hits the trees in a beautiful way. And so, there's beauty all around us. You just have to look for it. God is speaking everywhere. Are you listening?
Yeah, I like that. It's funny that you bring up the absence of a type of God. I don't think that needs to be the same God for everybody. But one thing that Nietzsche was famous for saying was that God is dead, and he kind of predicted a more cynical worldview, kind of perforating the planet because there wasn't kind of like an all uniting force that brought everyone together. At the same time, I think that there is a great sense of power that can come from believing in something, and it doesn't have to be the same thing as person A or B, but I think that's a big reason why in like recovery circles, believing in a higher power is so important, is because I think for some people it gives them a sense of morality. Like there are some codes that I should live by, but I think for other people there is a sense of protection and warmth and maybe some aspect of fate that comes from surrendering yourself to something that is greater than you, and that is oftentimes what's most difficult for people who are very like maybe cerebral and like and maybe logical. But there's a reason that it is so popular within those types of communities where people really need something stronger than themselves to hang on to.
Yeah, I'm not here to proselytize you or your listeners,
No, of course not. It's your perspective.
because I could, but I think what you're touching on is that we were made for something more than ourselves. You can't deny it for long. You can't run away from it. And then also with Nietzsche, God is not dead, obviously,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes for me, like it seems like it takes more faith to be an atheist than it does to be a believer, because I'm like, I mean, that worldview is terrifying. I'm like, you just believe we came out of nothing will be nothing? That requires a lot of faith in your end. But also, like, cynicism, right? I veer into cynicism a lot. It's one of my struggles because, but the other side of that is hope. And I have been such a hopeful person. And so, yeah, anyone who I guess is that cynical or so cynical, it's just because their hope has been dashed. And my hope and my prayer is that it'll come back,
Mm-hmm.
because cynicism will kill you in the end. You need that hope.
I agree. I think I used to be very cynical, and it didn't do me any good at all. And so I think a big part of my existential crisis was trying to overcome cynicism in a way that made sense for me. And I think it took me a long time to get there. But I totally agree with you that it's easy. It's easy to be cynical because
It
there's
is.
so many things that you could point out to as being like, hey, this is the reason why I don't have faith in anything. But
And
uh,
you've been hurt by things, and like I don't want
yeah,
to put myself out there and get hurt and hope for something and it gets dashed. But it's like,
yeah.
guess what? That's the world. Like I said earlier, like you're gonna have pain. To love means to hurt,
Hmm.
and you can't have one without the other. It's unfortunate, but this side of heaven, that's what it's like. And so, how to live in a way where that doesn't cause us to be permanently stuck in cynicism? That's the question.
Hmm. And I think that people forget that sadness has so much in common with caring. And one of the biggest things for me is just constantly trying to focus on gratitude whenever I feel
Mm-hmm.
overwhelmed or anxious or whatever negative emotions I'm currently processing. It's like whatever it is, there's always another side of the coin. Epictetus said that every pot has another handle or something like that, which is to say there's always two ways to look at something. And
I
um,
like that.
you could be anxious about your job or a failed relationship or anything in your life that's not going well, whatever feels like the ring that you're carrying. But then there's probably a lot to be thankful for on the opposite side of that. And then it's ultimately your choice to choose what you want to focus on.
Yeah, and I think what you said about choosing to be grateful is important. I've used that strategy many times. There's this section on the notes app on my phone called T2TB4, which is things to be thankful for. And I haven't done it lately, but I would do it every night. And I would have to, before I went to bed, I would do it in bed, write down three things that I'm thankful for today. And, I did this when my depression was very heavy a number of years ago, and it
Mm-hmm.
helped because even if I wrote there, I got through today, or I get to go to bed now, that was something I'm thankful for. But I found that the seasons I did that, I started it because I needed it. And it helped because what I found is that a lot of my anxiety was coming from things um, that either I didn't have or didn't have control over. And so when I focused on the things I did have that were good and the things that I could control, it did help.
I like that answer. And I think one of the things I always try to get out of people on here is, what is something that has really helped overcome some of those really overwhelming feelings like depression or anxiety. I like the idea of writing 3 things down that you're thankful of before you go to sleep. Is there anything else that maybe that you did that was really helpful for you?
Yeah, so it's been a long journey, one that I'm still on. Um, I actually last week entered another depressive spell for myself. So I have depression and anxiety. Um, I'm at a stage where now I can feel it like, you can feel that cloud descending on you. For me, I can feel it descending on my shoulders. I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, it's here. I'm going to have
Yeah.
to ride this storm out.
Yeah.
And sometimes, often, it's not triggered by anything. It's just, a chemical thing. You got to treat it like a cold.
Mm-hmm.
You got to take care of yourself in those times. And so that's the way to approach this. And obviously, everybody has differing degrees of depression and anxiety, and people have different things that work for them. And so
Mm-hmm.
I think my advice is to try a lot of the things and find what works for you. What works for me might not
Mm-hmm.
work for you. And so some of the things that I've done, firstly, I will couch all of my advice in this higher power thing. For
Mm-hmm.
me, my faith has been integral.
Sure.
I need the Lord. Like, I have a prayer journal. And if I didn't have that prayer journal, I'd be way more anxious.
Mm-hmm.
And if I didn't have the hope, I'm not sure I'd have gotten long term through to today. Um, and it's not just the hope of that things will get better one day or like things will change. It's a hope that goes sort of beyond this reality and understanding, um, that things will be okay. But yeah, so for me, my faith is the number one thing.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't mean that in terms of like a just pray away, pray the sin away or pray the anxious thoughts away. That doesn't always work.
Right.
So I don't mean it in the shallow terms of like this evangelical "you are victorious" kind of thing, but I mean it in terms of a grounded. It's less about ideology and theology and more about the secure relationship and state of your soul in the hands of Jesus. That's what it is for me. That He carries me when I'm in those places that nothing else here or myself can carry me. And I felt that, especially during the grieving process of Aletha,
Mm-hmm.
and in my darkest depression days. But other things that I've done is, number one, seek medical professional help.
Mm-hmm.
When I was first struck with my anxiety many years ago, this was before I was married, it was in my early 20s. I remember I was at a planning retreat that was 2 days long that we like to do as a church staff every start of every year, and we had to sort of come up with a plan for our ministry. And I looked at Cameron, who was sitting next to me. He was the youth pastor at the time, and I said, "Cameron, I can't even think about what to do today. I don't know what to do for the whole year." And I was just filled with so much anxiety. I called my friend because I didn't know what to do. I was like, actually, I almost started physically shaking. And I was so confused because I'd never felt that much anxiety. I'd always been an anxious person,
Mm-hmm.
always been a sort of, somber, happy-go-lucky, but inside somber, reflective, creative, sensitive type, but always very anxious. I always worry about everything. I always, I'm an anxious being. I can't not be anxious. That's my wiring. I don't know how to turn it off. Right?
Yeah.
Can I get an amen? Um, but so he was like, "I'm not surprised. It's like you've been carrying a lot. Your mechanisms of coping are no longer working, and you need to come up with a new plan."
Mm-hmm.
And so I actually called the doctor because I didn't know what to do. And so they scheduled a meeting with a mental health professional. I went in and I met with them, and I did a questionnaire. She's like, "Well, based on this, you're clinically depressed." And I was like, "Well, I didn't come in here for depression. I came in here for anxiety." She's like, "Well, they're linked."
Mm-hmm.
So that was the start of my journey, but something happened to me mentally and physically that I didn't know what was going on. And so you have to be able to seek out professional help. I know that there are places that do it for free or can do it at a discount if that's a problem. And so I have also seen a psychologist, my therapist, for over 10 years now. I first saw him in a group setting, and now I see him individually. He actually is he's in Ohio. He's in Ohio now. He moved back there. I'm in San Francisco, so now we do video conferences. I see him every 2 weeks, and he has been instrumental in my growth as a human being. He's also a Christian counselor, and I value his theology a lot, which aligns with mine a lot. And I think it's important to find someone who has the same beliefs as you, because you don't want to have to convince your therapist of something. You don't want to have to sort of have these discussions. You need someone who sort of gets a baseline understanding of you. And I would say try counseling out a number of times. Don't expect it to click in one session, and don't expect because you've had one bad experience that they're all bad. I highly recommend finding a psychologist or psychiatrist to talk to, because my guy has been instrumental in helping me sort of rid my unhealthy anxiety, helping me come up with coping mechanisms for my depression, and working through all my work strife and grief and family stuff. And there's been seasons where I haven't seen him. There's been like 1 or 2 years where I'm like, I'm good, and I don't see him, and then things happen and I see him again. So I highly recommend that. I also recommend medication. There's different kinds of medication. I'm on SSRIs. I last year increased my dose, and it helped because I reached a point where it wasn't helping. And I will say that it's not for everybody. Some people react badly to them. But again, try all these things together. Try a combination. Try different medications. But the medication really helped me, because for me it was a chemical thing as well. It's not just my natural anxious persona and psyche. It's also a chemical imbalance for me. And so what I found that the medication helped me is that it brought my playing field to an even level with everybody. Because for so long I would wake up in the morning and I would be at like a -10. And it would take me the whole day just to get to 0 or 1, and then I'd go to bed and have to start it over again. When I started the medication, it brought my starting level up to 0. And so I didn't spend all this energy just fighting to feel normal, to feel unanxious. What it does is it helps you reach this equilibrium where you can actually function better. And so, I'm not always at a 0. Sometimes I'm at a 2. Sometimes I'm at a -2, but at least I'm not at a -10. And so sometimes you need that little help. And then with the gratitude journal that we talked about, and praying really helps me. My prayer journal I used to do every night before I went to bed as well for many years. I'm sort of out of practice, and now I'm shifting it to the morning because of my life stage. It's harder for me to do it at night. But I found that when I would, in my prayer journal, I would sort of dump everything that I was worried about. And oftentimes by the morning I had forgotten about those things, or at least it wasn't as intense. And then the next night, I would be like, oh, I wrote about that last night? Oh, interesting. And so sometimes I would write about the same thing for 2 years, sometimes for 2 days. It's just keep at it and get it out of you. That's why meditation is so important. For me, the meditation is linked to prayer. But yeah, just get it out of you. And then there's the whole thing, do some exercise and go for a walk. I hate exercise. I know you've had your whole journey of getting swole, which maybe I'm open to doing this year. But just go for a walk. When I've been in some bad places as a parent, even, and my son and I are feeling weird fungus, we go for a little walk, and it really does help. Getting that fresh air, changing your surroundings, and getting your blood flowing really does help. And then finally, I guess I'll say, it will end. Like, whatever dark cloud has settled on you, the wave will crash, the storm will blow over, and you will be fine. You will get through it. Grab everything you can to make sure that you can get through it, but it does end.
I have thoughts on everything you just said, but I would hate to muddle them, because that was such a great way to end your story and probably this conversation. That was fantastic, and I think it's all just amazing advice, especially in terms of all the different ways that you can seek medical attention. I've tried all those too. Therapy, it's important to find the right one, and in terms of medication, also important to find the right one. You're not going to. Oftentimes, people don't figure it out on their first try, and you need to be experimental. But your mental health is worth it.
That's everything in life, right? You can't expect first time trying something for it to go swimmingly.
Exactly. Couldn't agree more. Well, Vincent, I appreciate you coming on here and sharing your story with us and sharing your wisdom with us. I have enjoyed every conversation that we've ever had, and this is no exception. So I just want to let you know that I appreciate you coming on so much and sharing your story with us.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks for having me. I will come back anytime.
that is all I have for you today. If you like this conversation, then I encourage you to check out Vincent's podcast, TheARTology. It's short, it's sweet, but it's awesome, and it's available wherever you listen to your podcasts. If I can ask you a quick favor before you continue the rest of your day, please consider giving this podcast a rating. Ratings are crucial in the first 2 months especially, and we are about 2 weeks away from that. So if you like this episode or any of the others, please consider leaving a rating. It'll take 2 seconds, but it would really help me out immensely, and you have my permission to consider it your good deed for the day. So good on you. Thanks for that. On the next episode, I chat with Drew Lucas, who is an ex-Marine, activist, artist, and all-around fascinating person. He's just one of those guys who seems to have lived many lives. I'm super excited to share our conversation with you, but that won't be out for a couple weeks, so stay tuned. Until then, hey, we're both still alive, right? So let's make the most of it. Until next time.